The thing about night shift custodial work is that nobody tells you what matters. They hand you a key card, a mop, a set of bays to clean, and a list of things not to touch. The rest you figure out by showing up. I'd been at Verath Detention Station for about 4 months when I first cleaned Bay 9. The station sat on the edge of the Tesserin corridor, a decommissioned dock complex that had been retooled as a holding facility sometime in the last 30 years. It was built for freight, not prisoners, and you could feel it in the bones of the place. The wide loading floors, the overhead crane rails nobody used anymore, the high industrial skylights that let the frontier sun cut long slats across the concrete at dawn. 16 bays, arranged in 2 rows of 8 along the main dock spine. Most of them held short-term transfers, beings moved between jurisdictions, awaiting processing, awaiting hearings that might take a week or might take a season. The turnover was steady. You cleaned a bay, it emptied, it filled again. Bay 9 was different. Bay 9 was at the far end of the south row, past the supply corridor, past the secondary utility junction that smelled faintly of coolant no matter what you did to the seals. It had its own reinforced door, not the standard sliding panel the other bays used, but a heavy pressure-rated hatch with a manual wheel lock and a strip of faded hazard tape across the frame. The hazard tape had been there so long it had gone brittle and gray at the edges. Someone had written "No Entry Containment Protocol" on a laminated card and taped it to the wall beside the hatch. The card was yellowed. The tape holding it was older than my tenure. I asked Gren about it during my first week. Gren Dar, night shift supervisor, 58, a quiet man who wore his station jacket zipped to the collar even in summer because he said the dock draft never let up. Gren had been at Verath for 11 years. Bay 9, he said, not looking up from the schedule board. Don't worry about Bay 9. It's on my route. Skip it. The rotation sheet says. Skip it, Torin. He looked at me then. Not unkind, more the way you'd look at someone reaching for a pan they didn't know was hot. Nobody cleans Bay 9. It's sealed containment, hazard protocol. The thing inside it is a threat designation, not a tenant. Environmental systems are automated. You don't go in. I nodded, I skipped it. For 4 months I walked past that hatch twice a night, once on the way down the south row, once on the way back, and did what Gren told me. The hatch stayed shut. The hazard tape stayed brittle. The laminated card stayed yellowed. And behind it something breathed. I could hear it sometimes, late in the shift when the station was quiet enough. A low, slow draw of air, deep as a bellows, with a faint rasp at the end that sounded like metal dragged across stone. I didn't know what was in there. I didn't ask again. The night I finally opened it was in my 5th month. I can give you the reason, but it wasn't dramatic. The environmental alert panel in the utility junction flagged Bay 9's internal temperature at 4 degrees below habitable minimum. The system was supposed to autocorrect. It hadn't. The override required a manual reset from inside the bay. I could have logged it and left it for the day crew. That's what the protocol said. But the day crew wouldn't get to it for 9 hours. And 4 degrees below minimum meant whatever was inside was cold, and getting colder, and had been getting colder long enough for the alert to flag. I turned the wheel lock. The hatch unsealed with a sound like a held breath letting go. Bay 9 was a loading bay. It had been a loading bay before the station was a station, and no amount of retrofit could hide it. The ceiling was high, 6 meters, maybe 7, with the old crane rail still bolted to the overhead beams. The floor was industrial composite, cracked in places, patched in others. The skylight panels ran the length of the ceiling and let in a thin wash of starlight from the corridors near sun. Along the far wall, the freight doors had been welded shut and plated over. Along the near wall, a row of environmental control panels blinked amber, one of them blinking faster than the others. That was my temperature fault. The dragon was in the center of the bay. I had never seen a dragon before. I knew the word. Everyone in the corridor knew the word. But knowing the word and standing 8 meters from the thing the word described are not the same experience. He was enormous. Not enormous the way a freight hauler is enormous, where your mind scales it against the dock and files it as large. Enormous the way geography is enormous, the kind of large that makes you recalibrate what a living thing can be. He lay on his side on the bare composite floor, his body curving in a loose arc that took up most of the bay's open space. His scales were iron gray, dark as old bridge steel, ridged along the dorsal line with plates the size of my forearm. Some of those plates were cracked. I could see it even in the dim utility light, fissures running through the ridges like dried clay, the edges lifting slightly where the scale beneath it thinned. His wings were folded tight against his flanks, the membrane between the long finger bones so thin I could see the shadow of the wall through it. His tail curled around one of the bay's support columns. His head rested on the floor, jaw turned slightly to one side, the nostrils wide, the breath coming slow. That rasp I'd heard through the hatch. It was the air moving over cracked tissue inside his throat. His eyes were open, gold and watching me. I stood in the doorway for a long time. I don't know how long. Long enough for the temperature alert to beep again behind me, reminding me why I was there. I crossed to the environmental panel. I reset the temperature fault. The heating element in the floor cycled on with a low hum, and I felt the air shift, warmer, barely, but moving in the right direction. I logged the reset on my keycard. I turned to leave. The dragon hadn't moved. His eyes hadn't moved either. He watched me the way a mountain watches, whether patient, unsurprised, and old enough not to flinch. I left, I sealed the hatch, I finished my shift. I went back the next night. I told myself it was to check the temperature. The panel was fine, the fault had cleared, the bay was holding at minimum habitable. But minimum habitable, I noticed, was 12 degrees. 12 degrees is what you set a storage unit to. It's not what you set a room to if something living is inside it. The system was calibrated to keep the contents from freezing, not to keep them comfortable. I adjusted it to 18. That was the default for the occupied bays. I logged it as a calibration correction. The dragon watched me do it. He didn't speak. He didn't move. But when I turned to leave, his head shifted a slight tilt, just enough to track me with one gold eye as I crossed to the hatch. The scales along his jaw scraped the floor as he moved, a sound like a file drawn across rust, and I saw that the scales there were cracked too, worse than the dorsal plates. The edges were lifting and dry, and the skin beneath was raw. I went back to the utility corridor. I filled a bucket with warm water. I found a clean cloth, not from the station supply, which was industrial solvent and grit paper, but from my own locker, a soft cotton rag I used for my hands after the acid wash bays. I carried both back to Bay 9. I set the bucket down 3 meters from his head. I wrung the cloth. I knelt. He didn't move. His eye tracked me, steady, gold, patient. The pupil was a vertical slit, contracted even in the dim light. Up close, the scale damage along his jaw was worse than I'd thought. The fissures ran deep, some of them crusted with a dark residue that might have been dried blood or might have been something else, some draconic equivalent I didn't have a name for. The healthy scales around the damage were still dense and hard, textured like hammered iron, each one overlapping the next in a pattern so precise it looked machined. But the damaged ones were brittle. When I touched the cloth to the first one, it shifted under the pressure, and he flinched. Not a large flinch, a tremor through the jaw, a slight catch in the breath. The way something very old and very tired reacts when it has been in discomfort so long that any touch, even a gentle one, registers as unfamiliar. I stopped. I waited. I kept the cloth where it was, damp, warm, resting against the cracked scale, and I waited until the tremor passed and the breathing settled. Then I cleaned, slowly, one scale at a time. The warm water softened the crusted residue, and the cloth lifted it away without pulling at the edges. I worked from the front of the jaw backward, following the grain of the scales, rinsing the cloth in the bucket when it got dark, wringing it, starting again. It took 40 minutes. The dragon didn't move except to breathe, and the breathing changed, slower, deeper, the rasp in his throat easing as the warmth worked into the tissue. When I finished, I emptied the bucket in the utility drain, rinsed the cloth, and hung it on the rail by my locker to dry. I didn't mention it to Gren. I didn't log it. I just showed up the next night and did it again. That was 3 years ago. I wish I could tell you there was a moment, a single, clean turning point, when the thing between us shifted from maintenance to something else. There wasn't. It accrued. Each night I came in, reset the temperature if it had drifted, cleaned the scales that needed cleaning, checked the ones I'd cleaned the night before to see if the edges had settled. Each night I talked. Not to him at first, to myself or to the room, the way you talk when you're working alone and the silence gets heavy. I'd mention what I'd had for dinner, or what the weather was doing outside the station's east windows, or how my knee was acting up in the cold, or what Gren had said about the supply shipment being delayed again. He listened. I knew he was listening because his breathing changed when I talked, the rasp eased, the rhythm slowed, the way a body relaxes when it's no longer alone. The first time he spoke was about 3 months in. I was cleaning a deep fissure along the ridge above his left eye, a bad one, where the scale had separated almost entirely and the tissue beneath was inflamed. I was being careful, and I was talking about the skylight panels, how the frontier sun came through them differently depending on the season, and how in the current rotation the light hit the south row floor at about 10 in the morning and made the whole corridor look like hammered copper. He said, "I remember copper light." His voice was deep enough to feel in my sternum, not loud. Quiet, actually, quieter than the breathing. A resonance that moved through the floor and up through my knees where I was kneeling. The words were clear, unhurried, spaced the way words are spaced when you haven't used them in a long time and you're not sure the machinery still works. I stopped cleaning. I looked at his eye, which was very close, large as my fist, gold, the pupil narrowed to a hairline. "You remember it from before," I said. He didn't answer. The eye closed slowly, opened again. The breath came, went. I finished the fissure. I rinsed the cloth. I said, "The light'll be on this side of the station in about 4 hours if you want to see it." He didn't answer that either. But the next morning, when the day shift custodial team did their walkthrough, one of them logged that the containment subject in Bay 9 had moved, shifted its body several meters across the floor toward the east-facing skylight panels. The day shift lead filed it as an anomaly. Nobody followed up. After that he spoke more. Never much. A word, a phrase, occasionally a full sentence, always in that low-floor resonance that I felt before I heard. He told me his scales had started cracking in his 3rd year. Not all at once, one plate at a time along the jaw first, where the surface tension was highest and the tissue beneath was thinnest. He had felt each one go, he said. A tightness, then a seam, then the slow lift of the edge as the moisture underneath dried out. He had no way to tend them. His forelegs could reach his flanks but not his jaw, and the bay floor was flat composite, no rough stone, no water, nothing a dragon could use to maintain the scales the way they were meant to be maintained. He had simply watched them crack and let them crack, and after a while stopped counting. He told me the food they slid through the service hatch was nutritionally adequate but cold, and that cold food tasted like nothing, and that tasting nothing for long enough made you stop being hungry, and that stopping being hungry was not the same as not needing to eat. He told me the lights in the bay used to cycle on and off on a schedule, but something in the timer had failed years ago and now they stayed on a permanent dim amber, which was not dark enough to sleep properly and not bright enough to see by. He told me he had not slept fully in years. Rest, yes, a shallow settling, somewhere between awake and not, but not the deep thermal sleep a dragon his age needed, the kind that let the body repair itself, the kind that required warmth and darkness, and the absence of the cold blue hum that the broken timer pushed through the bay's lighting grid at all hours. I fixed the light timer. It took me 2 nights. The control board was behind a panel in the utility junction that hadn't been opened since the station's last major refit, and the wiring was a generation older than the schematics I had access to. But I found the fault, replaced the relay, and reprogrammed the cycle. Warm amber during waking hours, full dark during the sleep window, with a slow transition between them that didn't jolt. The first night it worked correctly. Duran slept. I knew because I came in at my usual time, and his breathing was different, deeper, slower, without the rasp, the kind of breathing that meant the body had finally let go of something it had been holding. I heated his food, carried it back to the utility junction's warming plate, held it there until it steamed, carried it back. The first time I brought him warm food, he didn't eat it right away. He smelled it. His nostrils flared, and the cracked tissue in his throat produced a faint vibration, not quite a sound, more a tremor in the air, and he was still for a long time before he ate. He ate slowly. When he was done, the tray was clean, and the vibration came again, and I understood it was the closest thing to pleasure his damaged body could produce. I adjusted the environmental controls again. 18 degrees was better than 12, but it was still storage temperature. I set it to 22. I logged it as another calibration correction. Nobody checked. 5 months in, he told me his name. Duran, he said, just that. A single word, offered the way you'd hand someone a thing you'd been holding for a long time and weren't sure you'd ever get to put down. Torin, I said, Torin say. His eye tracked to me. The gold was brighter than it had been, or maybe I was closer, or maybe the new light timer cycle was letting more of the skylight through. Something in the way he looked at me shifted. Not gratitude. Something older than gratitude. Recognition, maybe, the kind that doesn't need context, that just registers. You are here. You are still here. Torin, he said. The resonance of it moved through the floor. I felt my name in my kneecaps. After that, I called him by his name. Every night when I opened the hatch, evening, Duran. Every night when I left, see you tomorrow, Duran. He never answered the greeting directly, but his head would turn and the rasp in his breathing would ease and the gold eye would find me in the doorway, and that was answer enough. Gren found out in my 2nd year. I don't know how, maybe the environmental logs, maybe the food warming pattern on the utility junction's power draw, maybe one of the day shift custodials mentioned the movement anomalies and someone traced it back. Gren found me in the break room at the start of shift and sat down across from me with the careful posture of a man about to say something he didn't want to. You've been going into Bay 9. I didn't deny it. There was no point. Torin, he rubbed his face. He looked tired, more tired than the shift warranted. That bay is sealed containment, hazard protocol, the thing in there. His name is Duran. Gren stopped. He looked at me the way he'd looked at me 3 years earlier when I'd asked about Bay 9 the first time, the hot pan look, but now there was something else in it, something closer to alarm. It doesn't have a name, Torin. It has a threat designation. Containment Subject 9. It's been in that bay for 14 years. It was sealed in there because it destroyed a settlement. 41 people. The condemnation order came from the corridor authority itself. It is not a tenant. It is not a patient. It is a containment subject with a permanent hostile classification, and you are not supposed to be in there. I'm cleaning it. He stopped again. He folded his hands on the table. He was quiet for a long time. Torin, I'm not going to write you up, but I need you to stop. If Director Halleys finds out. The environmental controls were set to 12 degrees, storage temperature. The food was cold. The lights were broken. The scales along his jaw were cracking down to the tissue. That's not your problem. Somebody's got to clean that bay, Gren. He looked at me. He didn't have an answer for that because there wasn't one. Nobody had cleaned Bay 9 in over a decade. Nobody had set foot in it. The containment protocol said automated environmental maintenance only, and the automated system had been quietly failing for years, and nobody had noticed because nobody checked, because the bay was sealed, because the thing inside it was a threat designation and not a living being that could be cold or hungry or cracking apart in the dark. Gren left. He didn't write me up. He didn't tell Hallie's. He also didn't tell me to stop again, which I took as permission, or at least as the absence of further objection, which in custodial work amounts to the same thing. I kept going. In my second year, Duran told me about the copper light. It came in pieces, the way everything came from him. A phrase one night, a sentence the next, a silence that lasted a week before the next fragment. He told me there had been a valley, deep, wide, forested with a river that ran copper in the late afternoon when the sun hit the mineral deposits in the sediment. He had lived in that valley, not alone with others, young ones. He used a word I didn't recognize, a low rumble with a click at the end of it, and when I asked what it meant, he was quiet for a long time before he said, in my language, the ones who had not flown yet. Hatchlings, he'd been caring for hatchlings. He told me the valley had been on the edge of a frontier expansion zone. He told me the settlement had come fast, faster than the surveyors had mapped, faster than the territorial agreements had been drafted. He told me he had tried to move the young ones. He told me there hadn't been time. He told me the settlement's forward crews had entered the nesting ground at night, with cutting equipment, to clear the tree line for foundation work, and the young ones had been in the tree line, and he had put himself between them. He didn't tell me what happened next. He didn't need to. 41 people, a territorial incident, a condemnation order from the corridor authority, the word destroyed in the file, the word hostile in the classification, and a sealed bay at the end of a dock complex where something enormous and inconvenient could be left to crack apart in 12-degree air and eat cold food and breathe through a damaged throat for however long it took for the problem to solve itself. I didn't say anything for a long time after he told me. I was sitting on the floor beside his head, my back against the support column his tail was wrapped around, the warm cloth in my hands. The skylight was letting in the early light, the frontier sun's first rays, slanting through the high panels, touching the top of his dorsal ridge and turning the iron-gray scales to something almost bronze. The young ones, I said, the ones who hadn't flown yet, did they make it? His eye found me. The gold was very bright. I don't know, he said. I wrung the cloth. I started on the scales above his left brow, where a new fissure had started since last week. I worked slowly. I'm sorry, I said. You were not there, he said. No, I said, but I'm sorry anyway. We didn't talk about it again. I came back the next night and the night after and the night after that. I heated his food. I cleaned his scales. I told him about the supply shipment and the weather and the way the dock draft came through the utility junction no matter what Gren did to the seals. He listened. He breathed. Sometimes he spoke. The woman appeared in my third year. I noticed her the way you notice anything on night shift, by the absence of the thing you were used to. The South Row corridor had a rhythm at night, empty from 2200 to about 0400. Then the early shift logistics crews started filtering through on their way to the freight office. Between those hours, the only people in the corridor were me and occasionally Gren doing his walkthrough. The woman broke the rhythm. She was small, slight build, dark hair cut close, a station-issue jacket that didn't quite fit, as if it had been requisitioned in a hurry from the wrong size bin. She was in the corridor at 0200, walking slowly, looking at the bay hatches as if she were reading them. Not the nameplates, the hatches themselves. The seals, the condition of the frames, the presence or absence of the hazard tape. She paused at Bay 9's hatch. She looked at it for a long time, then she walked on. I saw her again 2 nights later in the utility junction. She was standing by the environmental monitoring board, the one that displayed the temperature and air quality readings for all 16 bays, and she was looking at Bay 9's readings. The temperature read 22 degrees. The air quality read nominal. The status read occupied automated maintenance. She looked at the board, she looked at me. She didn't say anything, she left. I didn't think much of it. Verath got inspection personnel from time to time, corridor authority auditors, facility compliance officers, the occasional xenobiologist doing a welfare assessment of the short-term transfers. They came, they looked at boards, they filed reports, they left. She was probably one of those. I saw her 6 more times over the next 2 months, always at night, always in the South Row corridor or the utility junction, always near Bay 9. She never spoke to me. She never tried to enter the bay. She just watched. The 8th time I saw her, she was standing at the far end of the South Row corridor near the secondary exit, and the corridor light caught her at an angle I hadn't seen before, and I noticed something I'd missed. Her jacket collar was turned up, but beneath it, along the side of her neck, there were scales. Small, flat pewter green running from just below her ear to the collar line. Not a skin condition, not a tattoo, scales. I looked at her, she looked at me. Her eyes were gold. She left. I didn't see her again for 3 weeks. Meanwhile, Duran was getting worse. The cracking had spread from his jaw and dorsal ridge to the broad plates along his flanks. His breathing was slower than it had been when I'd started, which was not in itself alarming, because slower could mean more relaxed, more comfortable. But the rasp was deeper, and sometimes in the middle of a breath there was a pause, a hitch, as if the machinery of his lungs had to remember how to cycle. He ate less. Even heated, even brought to him, the food sat longer before he touched it. His fire, I had never seen him produce fire, but he told me once that the warmth in his throat was the last of it. The pilot light of something that had been enormous once was going out. I could feel it when I cleaned the scales near his jaw. In the early months, the tissue beneath the cracked scales had been warm, almost hot, radiating a deep internal heat that made the cloth steam when I pressed it to the fissures. Now it was barely above the ambient temperature of the bay. He was dying, not fast, not dramatically, the way something very old and very large dies when the systems that sustained it wind down one by one, and nobody is maintaining them, and the body has been running on stubbornness and inertia for so long that the transition from alive to not alive is less a cliff and more a long, shallow grade. I told him this, because I had never lied to him and I was not going to start. "You're getting worse," I said. I was sitting beside his head, the cloth in my hands, the bucket of warm water between my knees. The skylight panels were dark. It was deep night, no sun for hours. The bay lights were on their corrected cycle, a soft warm amber that I'd set because the factory default had been the cold blue-white of storage illumination, and I didn't like what it did to his scales. "Yes," he said. "Is there anything I can do, something I'm not doing?" His eye found me. The gold was dimmer than it had been. Not dark, still bright enough to catch the amber light and hold it, but thinner, as if the source behind it was further away. "You are doing it," he said. "It's not enough. It has been sufficient." I didn't know what to say to that. I wrung the cloth. I started on the new fissure above his left shoulder, a long one, running the length of 2 plates, the edges curling like bark on a dead tree. The tissue beneath was gray. "My people," he said. I stopped. He had never mentioned his people. In 3 years of fragments, the valley, the copper light, the hatchlings, the settlement, the tree line, he had never once said, "my people." He had spoken as if he were the only one, as if there were nothing beyond the valley and the bay and the slow work of cracking apart. "The Thessan," he said, the word resonated through the floor. "The Thessan sovereignty, I was their first elder, the founding blood." I kept the cloth where it was. I didn't move. 14 years, he said. "They may have stopped looking. They may not know I am here." The condemnation was sealed, no public record, no transfer notice, no next of kin notification. The authority did not consider it relevant. I was a territorial incident, a containment number. Duran, I am telling you this, he said, because I would like someone to know, before the rest of it goes, someone who would remember the name correctly. His eye closed. The breath came, slow and deep, with the hitch in the middle that meant the machinery was tired. Duran of the Thesson, first elder, founding blood. I was in a valley with copper light and young ones who had not yet learned to fly, and I put myself between them and what was coming, and I was not wrong to do it. You were not wrong, I said. No, he said, I was not. I finished cleaning the fissure. I rinsed the cloth. I sat with him until the skylight panels began to lighten with the first edge of the frontier dawn, and the iron-gray scales along his dorsal ridge caught the early light and turned to bronze, and his breathing settled into something close to sleep. I didn't leave right away. I stayed until the copper light, the real copper light, the one he described, the mineral sediment light from the frontier sun's first full angle, came through the panels and reached the floor beside his head. I watched it touch the cracked plates along his brow. I watched the bronze deepen. I watched his eye close, slowly, the gold dimming not into darkness but into rest. The shallow kind that was all he could manage, but that came easier now than it had 3 years ago, because the bay was warm and the scales were tended and someone was there. I went home. I sat in my apartment and stared at the wall for a long time. I made coffee and didn't drink it. I thought about a valley with a river that ran copper in the afternoon and young ones who had not learned to fly, and a being old enough to remember the shape of the world before the corridor was settled, putting himself between them and what was coming, and the word they used for it afterward, destroyed. I thought about 14 years of composite floor and cold food and cracking scales, and a door that nobody opened. The next night, the woman with the pewter green scales was waiting for me at the South Row corridor entrance. She was standing under the corridor light, and she was not hiding the scales anymore. They ran from her jawline down both sides of her neck and across the backs of her hands, small and flat and closely fitted, catching the light with a faint iridescence. Her eyes were gold, not amber, not hazel, gold with vertical pupils. She was not tall. She was not imposing. She stood the way someone stands when they've been standing in one place for a long time and they're ready to speak. You are the one who enters Bay 9, she said. Her voice was clear, unhurried. Accented, not an accent I could place, something older than the frontier dialects, something that sat underneath the language rather than on top of it. I clean it, I said. You do more than clean it. She looked at me with those gold eyes, and I felt the floor hum, a low vibration almost below hearing, the same frequency Duran's voice carried when he spoke. I have watched you for 4 months. You heat his food. You adjust his temperature. You clean his scales by hand with warm water on your knees. You talk to him. You call him by name. I didn't say anything. There wasn't a denial to make. My name is Liss, she said. I am a forward scout of the Thesson sovereignty. I have been posted to this station for 8 months. The first 4 I watched the station. The second 4 I watched you. The corridor was very quiet. The dock draft moved through the utility junction behind me. Somewhere in the far bays, a transfer subject shifted in its sleep. He told me, I said. Last night, he told me who he is. Something changed in her face. It was subtle, the muscles around her eyes tightened, the scales along her jaw flushed a shade darker, but it was there. An emotion I didn't have a human word for, something between grief and a fierce, desperate relief. He is alive, she said. It was not a question. Yes. For how long? I didn't answer that. I didn't have to, she knew. His condemnation was sealed, she said. No public record. The authority does not acknowledge the existence of containment subject 9. We have been searching for 14 years. We traced him to this sector 3 years ago, to this station 18 months ago, to this bay 8 months ago. But the condemnation seal means we have no legal standing to demand access. We cannot force the door. We cannot file an inquiry without revealing that we know he is here, which would allow the authority to transfer him before we could act. She paused. The gold eyes held me. So I have been watching, gathering evidence, building a case that will force the seal open. How long will that take? Months, perhaps longer. He doesn't have months. She was quiet, the scales on her hands darkened. I know, she said. I looked at her for a long time. I looked at the corridor behind her, the long row of bay hatches, the overhead lights, the dock floor I'd mopped 6,000 times. I looked at my hands, which were calloused from the acid wash bays and rough from the warm water cloths and permanently slightly damp from the work. What do you need? I said. She told me. It was not much, and it was everything. She needed a formal welfare complaint filed by a station employee, someone with direct observational access to the containment subject's condition. A complaint filed under the corridor authority's own welfare code, which required an immediate independent assessment and, critically, a temporary suspension of the containment seal pending that assessment. The complaint had to be filed by someone who had entered the bay, someone who had seen the conditions, someone who could testify, under the authority's own standards, that the containment subject was being held in conditions that constituted a breach of basic welfare protocol. Someone like the night cleaner, who had been going in for 3 years. If I file it, I said, I'm admitting I violated the containment protocol. That's a termination offense. Yes, she said. And Hallie's the station director. She'll know I've been going in. She'll lock the bay down. She might transfer him before the assessment team arrives. She might, Liz said. That is the risk. And if she does? Liz's jaw tightened. The scales along her neck flushed dark, almost charcoal. Then the Thessan sovereignty will act. But by then it may be too late. I thought about Duran. I thought about the cracking scales, the dimming gold, the hitch in his breathing. I thought about his voice saying, it has been sufficient. The way someone says a thing is enough when they know it isn't, but they don't want you to carry the weight of it. I filed the complaint at 0430, using the station's internal reporting system. I filed it under the Welfare Code, Section 11, Conditions Detrimental to Containment Subject Well-Being. I described the temperature, 12 degrees when I first entered, corrected to 22 by manual override. The food, cold, delivered through a service hatch with no warming protocol. The lighting, broken timer, permanent dim amber, corrected by manual override. The scale condition, extensive cracking and tissue degradation consistent with prolonged environmental neglect. I signed it with my name and my employee number. Director Hallie's called me into her office at 0600, before I'd left for the day. Maren Hallie's was 51, efficient, and uncomfortable with deviation. She had run Verath for 6 years, and in those 6 years the station had operated within its budget, met its compliance metrics, and avoided any incident that would attract attention from the Corridor Authority's Oversight Division. Bay 9 was not an incident. Bay 9 was a sealed line item on a quarterly report, one containment subject, permanent classification, automated maintenance, no action required. You filed a welfare complaint, she said. She was sitting behind her desk, and the complaint was on the screen in front of her, and her face had the controlled blankness of someone trying to decide which of several bad options to choose. Yes. You've been entering a sealed containment bay without authorization for 3 years. Yes. You understand that this is a termination offense. Yes. She looked at the complaint on her screen. She looked at me. She was quiet for a long time. The assessment team will be here in 72 hours, she said. That's the mandatory response window under Section 11. Until they arrive, Bay 9 remains sealed. You are suspended from duty, effective immediately. You will not enter the facility until the assessment is resolved. He needs. Mr. Say. Her voice was not unkind. It was the voice of someone who understood that something was wrong and also understood that acknowledging it formally would cost her things she could not afford. You are suspended. Please leave the facility. I left. I went home. I sat in my apartment for 72 hours and thought about Duran lying on the composite floor in 22-degree air with his scales cracking, and nobody coming through the hatch with warm water and a cloth, and the sound of a voice saying his name. On the third day, the Thessan sovereignty arrived. It was not a fleet. It was not a warship. It was a single vessel, long, dark-hulled, with the swept lines of a diplomatic courier, and a hull plating that shimmered with a deep iridescence I later learned was a living finish, scales grown onto the ship's skin by the Thessan artisan corps over decades. It entered the Verath approach corridor at dawn, announced itself to station control with a formal diplomatic hail, and requested permission to dock. I watched it from the apartment window. The frontier sun caught the hull as it turned, and the iridescence moved across the surface like light on water, and for a moment the ship looked alive, not like a machine carrying living things, but like a living thing itself, vast and quiet and ancient, gliding into the dock with the patience of something that had been traveling for a very long time. They came aboard at 0900. I know this because Gren called me Gren, who had never called me at home, who had never acknowledged knowing my personal contact, and said, in a voice that was carefully flat, "There are dragons in the station, Torin. They're asking for you." I walked to the station. It took 20 minutes. I could have taken the tram, but I wanted the walk and the morning air and the time to understand what was happening. The frontier sun was up bright, the kind of morning where the light comes down clean and makes everything look sharper than it is. I walked past the residential blocks and the service depot and the tram stop where the early shift logistics crew were gathering with their coffee and their manifests, and none of them knew what was happening at the station, and I didn't know how to explain it, so I kept walking. I thought about Duran. I thought about the gold eye watching me from the doorway. I thought about the first night I'd brought the warm cloth, and the tremor through his jaw when I'd touched the cracked scale, and the way the tremor had passed and the breathing had settled and I'd understood without anyone telling me, without any protocol or training or manual, that the thing to do was stay and be steady and keep the cloth warm and not leave. There were 4 of them in the main corridor when I arrived. 2 were large, not Duran large, but large enough to take up most of the corridor's width, their scales a deep burnished bronze, their wings folded close, their eyes tracking every surface with a calm, steady attention that made the station's fixtures look temporary. The third was Liz, standing slightly apart, her station-issue jacket gone, replaced by a fitted garment of dark fabric with a subtle scale pattern weave. The fourth was taller than Liz but smaller than the bronze pair, a female lean, with scales the color of old iron that lightened to pewter at the edges, and gold eyes that carried an expression I will remember for the rest of my life. She looked the way Duran looked when he said, "I remember copper light." She looked like someone standing at the edge of a thing they had been walking toward for 14 years. Director Hallies was there, and a man in a corridor authority uniform I didn't recognize, and 2 members of the assessment team who had arrived that morning, a xenobiologist and a welfare compliance officer. They were all standing in a loose formation near the south row entrance, and they all had the slightly dislocated expression of people who had expected a routine assessment and gotten something else entirely. The tall female saw me before I'd made it halfway down the corridor. Her head turned smooth, precise, the way a dragon's head turns, which is nothing like the way a human head turns, and her gold eyes found me, and she said something in a language I didn't know. A low, resonant phrase, the kind that moves through the floor. Liz translated. She says, "You are the one who opens the door." I stopped walking. Yes. The tall female crossed the corridor toward me. She moved slowly, not cautiously, but deliberately, the way you approach something you don't want to startle. She was larger up close than she'd seemed at a distance. The iron pewter scales were finely detailed, each one distinct, each one carrying a faint warmth that I could feel from a meter away, as if the heat inside her was closer to the surface than Duran's had been. She stopped in front of me. She looked down, I looked up. "I am Thesson Mara," she said. Her voice carried the same deep floor resonance as Duran's, but stronger, steadier, without the rasp. The same accent Liz carried, old, underneath the language. "I am the acting steward of the Thesson sovereignty, third elder, granddaughter of the founding blood." "Granddaughter," I said. "Duran is my grandfather." The corridor was very quiet. I could hear the dock draft in the utility junction. I could hear the hum of the overhead lights. I could hear my own breathing, which was not steady. "He's alive," I said. "He's not well, but he's alive." Something moved in her face. The same expression Liz had shown. That thing between grief and fierce relief that I didn't have a word for. The scales along her jaw flushed dark. Her eyes brightened, and for a moment I saw Duran's gold in them, the same gold, undimmed. "The welfare complaint you filed," she said. "It was enough. The assessment team's preliminary finding is that the containment conditions constitute a breach of welfare protocol. The containment seal has been temporarily suspended. We have been granted access to Bay 9. I nodded. I didn't trust my voice. "Torin say." She said my name the way Duran had said it, slowly, giving each syllable its weight, placing it carefully in the air. "Will you show us the way?" I showed them the way. I walked them down the South Row corridor, past the supply junction, past the utility corridor that smelled of coolant, past the bays I'd cleaned 6,000 times, the standard bays, with their sliding panels and their short-term tenants and their routine turnovers, past the secondary junction, down to the end of the row where the hatch stood with its wheel lock and its brittle hazard tape and its yellowed laminated card. I turned the wheel. I opened the hatch. The bay was warm, 22 degrees holding. The light timer was on its corrected cycle. The amber had shifted to the warm phase, the skylight panels catching the mid-morning frontier sun and sending long slats of copper light across the floor. Duran was where he always was, lying in his arc in the center of the bay, his head near the support column, his tail wrapped around the base. The iron-gray scales caught the copper light and turned to bronze. The cracked plates along his dorsal ridge were visible, the fissures, the lifting edges, the thinning tissue. But so were the ones I'd been cleaning, the ones along his jaw and brow where the warm water and the cloth had kept the crusting at bay and let the edges settle. His eye was open, gold, watching the door. Thesson Mara entered the bay. She crossed the floor slowly, her claws clicking on the composite, her scales catching the copper light. The two bronze escorts stayed at the door. Liz stood beside me. Thesson Mara stopped 3 meters from Duran's head. She was still for a long time, not frozen, not hesitating, but taking it in. The size of him, the cracking. The way the iron-gray scales had thinned to the point where you could see the shape of the bone beneath them in places. The wings folded so tight they had pressed grooves into his flanks. The tail wrapped around the support column, not for comfort, but because it had been wrapped there so long the scales had conformed to the column's curve. She lowered herself, not a bow, not a kneel, something else, something draconic, a folding of the forelegs and a lowering of the chest until her head was level with his. Her scales darkened. Her breath came in long, slow draws that synchronized with his, matching the rhythm, matching the rasp. It was instinctive, I think, something deeper than language, something that said I am here the way breathing says I am alive. She spoke not in my language. In the old one, the deep floor resonance, the clicks and hums that moved through the composite and up through my legs and into my chest. I didn't understand the words. I understood the tone. I have heard grief and recognition in every language I've ever been near, and it sounds the same in all of them. Duran answered. His voice was faint, fainter than it had been 3 nights ago, fainter than I'd ever heard it. But it was there. The gold eye brightened. The breath steadied. He said something in the old language, and Thesson Mora's head dropped and her eyes closed, and the sound she made was not a word but a vibration that filled the bay like a bell struck once and left to ring. Liz was beside me. I hadn't noticed her crying. I didn't know dragons cried, not like that, not the way she was doing it, with no sound, just the gold eyes bright and wet, and the scales along her jaw flushed dark. He said he remembered her, Liz said quietly. He said he remembered the day she first flew. He said it was in the valley in the copper light, and she banked too hard on the first turn and came down in the river, and he pulled her out and she was furious, and he told her she would fly again tomorrow. I didn't say anything, I couldn't. They moved him that afternoon. It took the Thesson Medical Corps, 2 specialists who arrived on the diplomatic vessel, 4 hours to stabilize his condition enough for transport. They worked in the bay, in the copper light, with equipment I didn't recognize and a gentleness that made my warm water cloths look like what they were, the best a man with a bucket could do. The cracked scales were treated with something that sealed the fissures and softened the edges. The rasp in his breathing was eased by a compound applied directly to the throat tissue. The dimming gold of his eyes brightened slowly over the course of the afternoon, as whatever they were doing reached the deeper systems. I stayed for all of it. Nobody told me to leave. Nobody told me to stay either. I just stayed. At 1400, Thesson Mora came to me. She had been with Durin for most of the day, speaking to him in the old language, her head beside his, their breathing synchronized. She crossed the bay to where I was standing by the hatch, and she stood in front of me, and she looked at me with those gold eyes. The Thesson sovereignty has maintained a registry since its founding, she said, a record of every act that has preserved the founding blood, every intervention, every kindness, every hand that held the line when the line was failing. The registry is permanent. It does not expire. It does not fade. I nodded. Torin Say, she said, night custodial worker, Verath Detention Station. 3 years, 107 documented entries into Bay 9. Temperature corrected from 12 degrees to 22. Food heated. Light timer repaired. Scale maintenance by hand nightly with warm water and a cotton cloth. She paused. The registry records the nature of the act, and it records the name the sovereignty gives it. What name? I said. We do not have a word in the old language for what you did, she said. The closest is a phrase. It translates roughly as the one who did not leave. It is used for the person who stays after everyone else has gone, not out of obligation, not out of instruction, because the door was there and they opened it and they did not stop opening it. I looked at her. She looked at me. The copper light was coming through the skylight panels at a low angle now, catching the edge of her iron pewter scales, catching the gold of her eyes. Will he be all right? I said. She was quiet for a moment. He will live. The damage is extensive and he will not be what he was. But he will live. Because of what you did, he will live long enough to see the valley again. The valley's still there. The valley is still there. The river still runs copper in the afternoon, and the young ones, she paused, her jaw tightened. The young ones he protected that night, they survived, all of them. They are grown now. They have young ones of their own. They have been part of the search. They have been waiting for him. I didn't trust my voice. I turned to the bucket by the hatch, my bucket, the one I'd carried down the corridor 6,000 times. I picked it up. It was empty. I'd already drained it. You are welcome among the Thesson, Thesson Mora said. Not as a guest, as a name in the registry, as one of ours. There is a place for you, if you want it. I looked at the bucket in my hands. I looked at Bay 9, the warm light, the composite floor, the old crane rail on the ceiling, the skylight panels letting in the late afternoon copper. Durin was being lifted by the medical corps, slowly, carefully, his body supported by a framework I didn't have a name for. His eye found me across the bay. Gold. Steady. Thank you, I said, but I've got 11 more bays to clean tonight. Thesson Mora looked at me. She didn't argue. She didn't press. She inclined her head, the slight, precise dip of acknowledgement I'd seen Duran make when I said something that landed, and she returned to her grandfather's side. They departed at sundown. The diplomatic vessel undocked with the same slow patience it had arrived with, the living hull catching the last of the frontier light, the iridescence moving across the surface like something breathing. Duran was aboard, stabilized, treated, still cracked and worn but alive, breathing without the rasp for the first time in years. I watched the vessel from the South Row corridor, through the skylight panels. It turned slowly in the dock approach, and the iridescence rippled, and for a moment the hull's scale pattern caught the copper light at the same angle that Duran's dorsal ridge had caught it that morning, and the resemblance was so precise it hurt. The vessel cleared the dock. It entered the corridor's transit lane. The iridescence faded into the distance, and then it was gone, and the skylight showed only the familiar sweep of the frontier sky and the far-off scatter of the corridor stars. I stood there for a while. The corridor was quiet. The dock draft moved through the junction behind me, the same draft Gren had been complaining about for 11 years. The lights hummed. The station settled around me the way it always did at shift change, not silence, but the particular quiet of a place between one day's work and the next. Gren found me in the utility junction 20 minutes later. He was holding 2 cups of the break-room coffee, which was terrible, and which he drank by the liter. He handed me one. I took it. "You going to be all right?" he said. "I'm suspended." Hallie's lifted it. "The assessment team's preliminary finding cleared you. Welfare Code complainants are protected from disciplinary action under Section 11. You're back on shift tonight." I looked at the coffee. It was terrible. I drank it. "Bay 9's empty," Gren said. He said it carefully, the way you mention something you know is heavier than it sounds. "I know." He didn't say anything else. He finished his coffee, put the cup in the sink, and went to do his walkthrough. That was Gren. No ceremony, just the work. I clocked in at 2200. I collected my keycard, my mop, my bucket. I walked the North Row first 8 bays, standard routine, nothing out of the ordinary. Then the South Row, one by one. The supply corridor, the utility junction, the coolant smell. Past the secondary junction. Bay 9's hatch was open. Not sealed, not locked, open. Thesson Mora's people had left it that way. The hazard tape was gone. The laminated card was gone. The wheel lock was disengaged. The bay was empty, no dragon, no framework, no medical equipment. Just the composite floor, the old crane rail, the skylight panels letting in the frontier starlight. I stood in the doorway for a long time. The temperature read 22 degrees. The light timer was still on my cycle. The air smelled faintly of the compound the Thesson medics had used, something warm, something that reminded me of copper and river stone and a valley I had never seen. I set my bucket down. I filled it from the utility junction tap, warm water. I wrung my cloth. Then I cleaned the bay. Not because it needed cleaning. It was cleaner than it had ever been. Because that was the work, and the work was what I did, and doing it was the only language I had for the things I didn't know how to say. When I was done, I stood in the doorway again. The skylight panels were beginning to lighten. 4 hours until the copper light. I picked up my bucket. I moved on to Bay 10. The mop was still damp. The shift was still young. I had a station to clean.